On April 4th, 1922, something truly horrifying was discovered on a secluded farm just outside Munich. All 6 people living there had been slaughtered in ways so brutal that even seasoned investigators were left shaken. What makes this story so twisted is that evidence and eyewitnesses suggest the killer didn't just show up one night, commit the crime, and leave. No, the killer had been living undetected on the farm for nearly 6 months before the murders. But before we dive in deeper, let me tell you, if you're drawn to chilling stories like this one, you're in the right place. We cover unsolved mysteries, eerie disappearances, and more every week. The grotesque story of Hinterkaifeck Farm begins with the farm itself. This wasn't just any rural home. Nestled between Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen, it was remote and isolated, about 50 miles from Munich. The property sprawled out across fields and a small forest, with a residential house and several barns, all connected by a series of narrow, dimly lit passages. These passages would soon become an eerie symbol of the nightmare that played out there. The nearest neighbor, Herr Schlittenbauer, lived half a mile away. This made Hinterkaifeck not only lonely, but a perfect place for secrets. The farm was home to the Gruber family, a wealthy, well-off household, but not a particularly well-liked one. In fact, the Grubers were feared and whispered about in the village. They were seen as strange and secretive, even sinful. Much of what remains known about them today paints a grim picture. At the head of the family was Victoria Gruber, the 35-year-old owner of the farm. Victoria's life was far from idyllic. She was a modest and attractive woman, but her existence was overshadowed by the dark reputation of her father, Andreas Gruber, a man with a sinister past. Victoria's marriage in 1914 to Karl Gabriel was less about love and more about money. Karl, a calculating man, married her for her wealth. He secured his future by fathering a daughter with Victoria before enlisting in the German army. But the true darkness of the Gruber family lay with Andreas. Andreas Gruber was a deeply despised man, known for his violent temper and heinous acts. He regularly abused his daughter, subjecting Victoria to unspeakable horrors. When Victoria confided in a local priest about the abuse, he broke the sanctity of confession and spread the scandal throughout the district. Things took a dark turn when Herr Schlittenbauer, the Gruber's neighbor, found himself seeking comfort from Victoria after his wife's death. Not long after, Victoria found herself pregnant with her second child, Josef. But the question of who fathered the child sent shockwaves through the community. Some whispered it was Schlittenbauer, others were certain it was Andreas. In the end, Schlittenbauer stepped forward, acknowledging paternity, but the whispers never stopped. Now imagine the scene on Hinterkaifeck Farm. Victoria, struggling with 2 young children, trapped in a house with her abusive father, Andreas, and his frail elderly wife. They were isolated, no neighbors for half a mile in any direction. The house itself, cold, sprawling, with twisting hallways and narrow stairs, sitting ominously on the edge of a dense forest. It's the kind of setup that practically screams something bad is about to happen. And in fact, it did. In December 1921, the farm's maid left the farm in a rush. This wasn't uncommon. Servants rarely stayed long at Hinterkaifeck. Andreas was a stingy employer with a notoriously nasty temper. But this maid's reason for leaving was different. She believed the farm was cursed. Strange, unexplainable things were happening at night. She heard footsteps echoing in the dark, doors creaking, and the faint clink of dishes. She constantly felt watched, as if unseen eyes were always on her. One night, when she went to get a drink of water, she spotted a vague, dark figure standing near the barn. When the figure turned and faced her, she ducked behind a door, trembling with fear. And when she finally summoned the courage to look again, the figure was gone. Convinced the farm was haunted, she left the next morning, never looking back. Andreas dismissed the maid's fears as nonsense and seemed more pleased than concerned. After all, now he didn't have to pay her. From then on, Victoria was left to handle the chores alone. But as time went on, it became clear she couldn't manage everything by herself. Few weeks later, in January 1922, the family woke up after a night of terror. They had heard noises outside during the night that no one could explain. In the early morning, Andreas opened the front door of the farm, but the first thing he saw in the snow was a set of footprints leading from the nearby forest to the farm. The tracks were fresh, and yet they led to the farm and stopped abruptly at the house. What's more bizarre is that there was no set of footprints leaving the farm. As to whoever was that person, he just vanished into thin air. In the months leading up to the murders, the Grubers began hearing strange noises from the attic. The sounds were described as footsteps, rustling, and even whispers at times, coming from above. Andreas Gruber checked the attic several times, but each time he found nothing. Eventually, he became so disturbed by the sounds that he locked the attic door, but the noises continued. On the night of March the 29th, 1922, Andreas woke up to another strange sound coming from the attic. It was a soft creaking, like someone, or something, was moving around up there. At first he thought maybe it was just the house settling, but the sound didn't stop. Lying in the dark, he listened, his heart beating faster with every second of silence that followed. A few minutes later, he noticed something else. A faint light flickering in the forest just behind the farm. It moved slowly, like someone was out there with a lantern. Grabbing his gun, Andreas stepped outside and scanned the tree line, but the light was gone. When he returned to the house, he immediately went to check the attic where he had heard the noise, but found nothing out of place. Everything was exactly as it should be, except the locked attic door was now unlocked. The next morning, Andreas discovered 2 sets of footprints in the fresh snow. They led from the forest to the barn, but didn't return. Inside the barn, nothing seemed out of place. But there was a newspaper in the house, a paper none of them had purchased. By now, a reasonable person would have sounded the alarm. Someone was not just lurking, but living on the farm. But Andreas, ever the stubborn and prideful man, brushed it off. He went to the market, casually mentioning the strange happenings, and bragging about how he'd deal with any intruder using his gun. Before heading home, Andreas stopped in Ingolstadt to hire a new maid, Maria Baumgartner. Maria was no stranger to hardship. She had lived a life marked by severe depression, and her limp, caused by one leg being shorter than the other, made her the target of ridicule. She had never married, never had children, and had recently been let go from her previous job due to her constant sorrow. In many ways, Maria was an outcast, much like the Grubers. But she was eager to start anew and accepted the job with relief, returning to Hinterkaifeck with Andreas that very day. As night fell over Hinterkaifeck Farm, everything was strangely quiet. The darkness wrapped the place in an unsettling calm. But what happened in the days that followed would haunt the small Bavarian town for generations. Based on investigators' reports, here is a reconstruction of the events between March 31st and April 4th. On April 1st, 1922, Victoria's eldest daughter, Cecilia, didn't show up for school. This wasn't like her. The postman, delivering the daily newspaper, noticed something odd. No one answered the door. The lights glowed softly in the windows. Smoke curled from the chimney, but the farm was eerily quiet. No people, no animals in sight. With no one to greet him, he left the newspaper on the doorstep and carried on his way. Later that day, a coffee merchant arrived for a business meeting with Andreas. He knocked and waited. Despite the warm glow from the windows, no one came to the door. After standing in the cold for nearly an hour, he left, frustrated and cursing under his breath. When he glanced back, the newspaper was no longer on the doorstep. On April 2nd, the Gruber family's absence from church raised eyebrows. Still, no one thought much of it. That evening, a village carpenter passed by the farm. Near the edge of the forest, he spotted the flicker of a lantern's light. Thinking it might be Andreas, he called out his name. Instantly, the light vanished, leaving the carpenter puzzled and uneasy. The day after the postman returned, once again, no answer. Peering through a window, he noticed little Yosef's carriage sitting in the same spot it had been since April 1st. A creeping sense of unease washed over him. Something wasn't right. Yet The animals were quiet, a sign that someone must be tending to them. He left the newspaper by the window and departed, a knot of anxiety growing in his chest. The next day, the newspaper was gone. On April 4th, a mechanic arrived, ready to repair an engine as scheduled. After waiting fruitlessly for someone to meet him, he found the outbuilding unlocked and the engine inside. He worked for hours, the clamor of his tools and his spirited singing echoing through the silent farmyard. No one appeared. Finished, he left and encountered the postman at the gate. Sharing his concern, the postman, now thoroughly unnerved, made his way to the nearest house, the home of Lorenz Schlittenbauer. At 4 p.m. the same day, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, along with a group of 4 men, arrived at the Hinterkaifeck Farm. A haunting silence greeted them. The sun was setting, casting long shadows, but there was no smoke curling from the chimney, no flicker of light in the windows. The barn door stood ajar, its creak lost in the growing twilight. The men stepped inside the barn and froze. In the corner lay a tangled mass of limbs, a horrifying pile of bodies partially covered with straw and an old, removed door. As they drew closer, they realized the grim reality. 4 corpses, brutally slain, lay atop one another. The victims were Andreas Gruber, his wife, his daughter Victoria, and her eldest child Cecilia. Each had been killed by a series of powerful blows to the head with a mattock. The barn floor was soaked with blood and brain matter, and deep, deadly wounds covered their skulls. Cecilia, only 5 years old, had clung to life longer than the others. Strands of her hair were found in her tightly clenched fists, torn out in a desperate frenzy, likely from shock or despair, as she lay amidst the bodies of her family. Inside the house, their grim expectations were confirmed. Little Josef had been killed in his crib, his skull split open with such force that the blood spattered the ceiling. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, was found in her room, her head also smashed. She had been tucked into her bed as if in a twisted attempt at care after death. Despite the gruesome nature of the murders, nothing of value had been taken. The wealthy Gruber family's possessions were untouched. A wallet brimming with cash lay undisturbed in the nursery. In a closed room, the family's guard dog was found tied up, beaten but alive and clearly fed, as were the farm animals. The police investigation revealed a chilling picture. The murderer wore rough men's shoes and moved with confidence, leaving bloody footprints in nearly every room. Outside the house, investigators found the same strange footprints that had been discovered earlier by Andreas Gruber in January. These tracks led from the nearby forest to the farm, but disappeared upon reaching the house. They were large, single-file footprints, but no one could figure out who they belonged to. When tracking dogs were brought in, they followed the scent to the edge of the forest before stopping, unable to trace the killer any further. The killer struck with cold precision. Either waiting in the barn or luring them there, he attacked each family member as they entered, one by one. After the killings, he fed the animals, then retreated to an outbuilding where he cut himself a piece of ham, cheese, and poured milk, eating with apparent satisfaction. The most disturbing detail was the likelihood that the killer had been living on the farm for up to 6 months before the murders. He moved stealthily at night, taking just enough food to avoid notice, and somehow managed to keep the animals calm. The mysterious newspaper found on the farm pointed to trips outside, into the forest or the nearby town. Even after the killings, the murderer lingered for at least a day. He fed the animals, stoked the fire, and read the latest newspaper left by the postman before disappearing into the woods, leaving no clear trail behind. Finally, there was one more horrifying detail. While a single blow would have been enough to kill, the autopsy revealed that the women of the Gruber family were struck 8 to 9 times, their heads reduced to bloody pulp. In contrast, Andreas and Josef were killed with fewer blows, suggesting a chilling, calculated ferocity aimed specifically at the women. In another twist, some accounts claim that the bodies of the victims from the Hinterkaifeck murders disappeared during transportation to Munich for examination, never to be found. To this day, no one knows who committed the murders. Some say it could have been Carl, who returned from the war, seeking revenge or wanting to be the sole heir to the family fortune. But according to the records, Carl died on the front lines. Others speculate it was a wanderer or a deserter with no clear motive, and some even suggest it could have been a deranged murderer who took pleasure of watching them. Local rumors swirled around Schlittenbauer, the man who was often seen hanging at the site of the former farm, leading many to believe he couldn't live with the guilt. But Schlittenbauer had an airtight alibi, and he didn't quite fit the profile of a cold-blooded murderer. Now, all that's left of the farm is a small monument marking the place where the Gruber family and their maid were brutally murdered. And as the Hinterkaifeck Farm's murders remain unsolved to this day, the mystery continues to haunt anyone who's dared to look into it. Was it a random killer who stumbled upon this remote farm? Or was it someone who knew the Grubers intimately? What drove this killer? How did they stay hidden for so long? And why, after all the brutality, did they leave the farm untouched? We may never know for sure, but if you're fascinated by cases like this one, dark and twisted, be sure to check out our other videos. And hey, if you have your own theories or new information, I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we dive deeper into the world of true crime. Who knows, maybe you'll be the one to unravel the next dark mystery.